everyone, and welcome to the Language and Identity Seminar. This is a webinar organized by Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo, and we will discuss the relationship between language and identity. And this is the fourth edition, and we have 3 more talks organized coming in a few weeks. My name is Naoko Sokawa. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College, and I'm the moderator of the talk today. So today I have a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jiwoon Kier. And Dr. Kier is a young Min KF associate professor at Korean Language and Linguistics at the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford, as well as a senior research fellow at the Hertford College at the University of Oxford. And she's a specialist in theoretical linguistics, applied linguistics, as well as Korean and East Asian linguistics. And she's an author of a great number of books and articles. Her most recent works include the Routledge course in Korean translation, published in 2017, Delicious Words, East Asian Food Wars in English, published in 2020, as well as Translingual Words, an East Asian lexical encounter with English, published in 2019, which we will hear more about today. So for this seminar, Dr. Kier will give us a talk entitled Translingual Words, is sushi a Japanese word or an English word? Based on her monograph, Translingual Words, an East Asian lexical encounter with English. I will also introduce our commentator of this talk, who is Mariette Regner. She is a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College here at the University of Tokyo. Her primary research interests are cognitive semantics, pragmatics, corpus linguistics, and application of quantitative method of language data analysis and digital humanities method to language teaching and learning. She authored her PhD thesis on perception and expression of time and space in Japanese native speakers at Research Center for Japanese Language and Linguistics at Oriental Institute, University of Oxford. And Mary is currently working on her first book on time and space in Japanese. So now let us listen to Dr. Kier. Dr. Kier, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I share my screen first. Thank you so much for inviting me to this really interesting series, Language and Identity Seminar. I'm really happy to be part of this seminar because, in a way, I think this is something that everyone, not just a few, everyone thinking, questioning, trying to find the answer. And I hope we can kind of I can kind of give you some of my thoughts. Also, I want you to also think about your own language and identity within very much like a multicultural, multilingual context. So. This question, I will start with this question, today's talk. Is sushi a Japanese word or an English word? This is the question actually I've asked to many people, students, English students and Japanese students back in almost, I think now 9 years ago. And I thought, is sushi a Japanese word? Many people said, oh yeah, of course it's a Japanese word. But also sushi is in the OED, Oxford English Dictionary, and used a lot by English speakers. So can we say this is just Japanese word? Maybe it's just English word too. How can we think about the identity of those words? And then I think about my own identity too. Well, I'm Korean, as you can see, but I lived in England 20 years, so I can't just say I'm just Korean. Well, I have some sort of English identity too. So. Who am I? The question goes back to who am I? I'm Korean, and also I'm some kind of, I could say I'm English too, some sense. So, like when you think about people, words, everything around us, we kind of realize that it's very difficult to say this is Korean or this is Japanese or this is English. In a way, it's very much the case, how should I say, the word mother tongue. In the past, people use the word mother tongue in a very singular term, the native language, one mother tongue. But these days, well, when I go to my kids, my younger daughter's school. It's a very small school in Oxford. There's 25 kids in classroom, small. But the language, I did some sort of language diversity project in the school, and they said the language spoken in that small Oxfordshire school, the number of languages spoken in the school is 60. And some of the languages I never come across. I'm a linguist, but I didn't know the languages at all. So we can kind of think about this. Wow, this is not just a few words or a few people's lives. Everybody's life are somehow interwoven, and our identity, you can't just say one way, like, I'm Korean speaker or some, it's kind of, we all lived, and our life trajectory projects layers of language and cultures. And that's what I'm going to talk about. It's sort of through the lens of the words. And particularly, as you can see now, some food words. And I'm very interested in the food words because I love food. I love cooking. I'm not sure that I'm really good at it, but I'm very good at eating. So yeah, lots of translingual words. Okay. So the translingual words, is it Korean word? Is it English word? So this kind of the talk I'm going to talk about is based on my book, which I written 2018, translingual words. So I kind of coined this new term. I mean, people use the word translingual, but I think I kind of first coined the word translingual words in terms of calling those words translingual. So sushi, many people say, well, this is Japanese origin, but it's also English word because it's in English language. And actually, if I can tell you the result of the survey that I've done about 8 years ago, when I asked students, British students, Japanese students, what do you think about the word sushi, their identity? What do you think, what would you guess? Very interestingly, the answer was not quite straightforward. And people say, oh, Japanese, of course, this is Japanese word, but British students, English students think that, well, sushi is also English word. They don't have, when I kind of survey those words, particularly culinary words or the words that they find familiar, they say, well, actually, not like say, well, definitely this is Japanese word, but most of people feel, okay, this is Japanese words, but also English words too, because I hear these words all the time. Sushi becomes very much one of the words that settles very well in English language. So we can see, oh, this is Japanese. But most of the students say, I don't care really. Oh, it's Japanese or like people think, oh, it could be Japanese, it could be English words. And in a way, could have multiple identities. And then I think about other words too. So many words that we somehow coined the word borrowing. When you think about the word borrowing or loan, means that you borrow something and then you have to return it. It's always have this sort of like non-native identity. But I'm also working on this new project called Beyond Borrowing. So basically the word borrowing, loan, really not really quite the word that we can say or suitable to describe lexical situation of our time. Let's give you one more example. Like I don't know whether you are followers of Korean drama, but or these two Korean words that Korean origin word entered Oxford English Dictionary this last week, were chicken and mukbang. And mukbang is one of the words, like sort of like if I translate the word mukbang, it means ikas. So you cook delicious food and you eat. And people want to watch that film, that video, because they also want to make and want to participate the enjoyment, I would say. So, like the mukbang and chimek. But these two words somehow coined and they entered English language. But somehow when you think about chimek, chi is from chicken. Korean word chimek, the chi part is from chicken, and meg is Sino-Korean word meg, which means beer. So when you think about when you really look at the word chimek, which everybody said this is Korean word, but actually it's a hybrid word. Chi from chicken English, and then meg from Chinese. But it's somehow coined, blended, and become popularized through Korean wave. So when you think about chimek, okay, the Koreans don't think chimek is Korean word. If you ask Korean, what do you think about Korean chimek? Oh, it's I know what it means, but I don't think it's Korean word. As a result, chimek is not in any of the dictionary. People don't think this deserves a place in dictionary, whereas OED thinks this is the word that deserves place because so many people use it. So what I'm trying to say is that actually, again, like this identity, it's so much difficult to say this is sort of one-sided borrowing when you think about chimek. Is it borrowing? we know English people didn't, English language didn't give us the word chimek. The part of it that has, I would almost say, heritage part, but it's not like, the way how it assembled, the use, nothing to do with Anglophone words. So when you think about the identity of these words, again, like say, well, it's very difficult to use the word like borrowing or like loan. So I thought, then how could you define those words, not just one word, multiple words, all the words basically. Some words are more visible, more like used, but some maybe not. But in this ever global, diversified and globalized world, what are these? What is the identity of these words? At the same time, my hidden question is, what is our identity? Who am I again? Because language and our identity is so much close interwoven. So this is kind of the way how I thought about the word translingual word, transcultural word. So kind of the global word that used by everyone. Of course, in a way, Roman alphabet, in English alphabet, very useful in a way. It's very sort of, everybody can, at least when it comes to accessibility, everybody knows how to write Roman alphabet, English alphabet. So Romanization is very sort of easy to use, everybody to use. But somehow when you think about the identity of those words, the meanings, forms, identities, it's not like straightforward like one or the other. Just like we can't just say anymore mother tongue. Like I was also talking about in the other day, why should it be mother tongue? Many fathers are looking after kids too. So it's parents' tongues, or like, this. When we are facing this situation right now, because in our time it's kind of really ever globalized, multilingual, multicultural time. So we are thinking about our identities and the identities of words in a very new way. And in this context, I kind of coined this word translingual words. Okay. So, but the translingual words was this word in a translingual words, but in another way, we could say this global words. But the heritage may be all different. As I said, like it's Romanized, but in a way, it could have, just like us. Well, I live in Oxford, but I have Korean heritage. So many of you, when I think about, Maria, for example, she lives in Japan, but she has Russian heritage, but she also speaks in daily basis, I think many times English. So when you think about all lives and our languages, there's so many multiple languages and cultures. So but in a way, there's not much sort of like a, how should I say, boundary. Well, I'm going to be Korean this side, 25%. My daughters often say, well, mommy, I'm 25% Korean, 25% English, 25% Danish, but it doesn't work in that way, because the way how we interact all the time, it mixes and mingles. I speak Korean, but sometimes English, all mixed around. Everybody's language is kind of all mixed. And this, I think it's very beautiful that we are able to do that, and in a way represent our identity too, which is kind of not easily defined by monolingual ethos, but everybody is kind of really multilingual, multicultural, and the way how we interact really shows how we are able to kind of able to speak between and beyond languages. I think this will go back to another question, like what is language and languages? So kind of what I think the way how we interact using languages and words show how we do communicate beyond and between languages, which in sort of social linguistic terms these days they call translanguaging, but it's kind of really the border of language really make us question whether it does exist, just like whether the Korean English border sometimes not really doesn't exist, like whether the Japanese English. So I think it's sort of like this borderless language use. That's again, I can think about these translingual words, and so many translingual words these days. The words that like sushi. When I talk about sushi, for example, but then another word like sashimi, I pronounce sashimi in a very much anglicized way. And I think this is how very many global people hear the word sashimi, not in Japanese way, but in an anglicized way, sashimi. Like, so the pronunciation again, like no Japanese people can say, oh, you should pronounce this in particular way, or let's talk about sake, for example. Sake in English is used to, sake in Japan means that, general liquor. But whereas in English, when people talk about sake, it's Japanese liquor. So the meaning and the form, the way how the word used are very much different from when it was originally used in the context. So it is inevitable. I'm Korean, but the way how I live here, the way how I interact is very different from the way how I did in Korea. Just like the same with words, when the context changes, the way how the meanings are used, the forms used, all different, because it's very much, as we all know, context sensitive. The situation or everything changes the meanings too. So sake is when it's used in English, it's kind of Japanese liquor. Just like chicken, when you think about shimek and chicken, chicken in English means just chicken, like just bird chicken. But when chicken is used in Korean or Japanese context, chicken doesn't have the very neutral meaning, but chicken is chicken, like means like sort of particularly Western style cooked chicken or Kentucky Fried Chicken. That's the chicken, not like chicken soup in general. So when I think about what I'm trying to say is that the word, even if that had a particular origin, if the word settles in different places, their lives all become different. So even if the same word, but the form, identity, pronunciation, romanization, all could be diversified. But when it particularly comes, because we are also living in social media time, the circulation or spread of the words are super fast. In the past, if you just watch national or like local news, television or read local newspaper, you wouldn't really come across many loan words. And it was the case that mainly the elite class or those who are very well educated, young people, they come across new words and they introduce those words. Nowadays, because of this again, social media, globalization, actually everyone can access. And I would almost say that COVID-19 somehow brought it kind of the challenge much more, closer. So now we know how to do things on Zoom. I don't have to go to Japan, although I love to go to Japan, but I can do it to you who are in Japan, talk in Oxford in the morning, in your evening. So we kind of again crossed a lot of physical borders and we're able to communicate. And anyway, this social media, like online communication, these things actually made the sort of translingual life really alive and become visible throughout, without borders, across the world. If I give you one example again, from very popular Korean drama right now called Squid Game, 오징어 Game. And I don't know whether you watched 오징어 Game or you heard about 오징어 Game. In the 오징어 Game, there's the main character is making something called the dalgona candy, and which I used to do when I was primary school kid, like dalgona candy. And Koreans often say, "Oh, dalgona it's not something like privileged cultural item," but like how could dalgona be known to everyone? So people. Different places actually try to make dalgona and put it in the poster and Twitter and social media, Facebook. So now dalgona is another word that we'll be thinking about. And of course, in last year there was sort of very much big hit again, like through TikTok. That dalgona coffee recipe became super popular, and people ask me, how could I make dalgona coffee? Well, I don't know. I have to try it out. So but dalgona, no. Korean knows the meaning of dalgona, the etymology of dalgona. It's somehow, settled as a sort of everyday word, and we used it when I was young. And how could that word have the stage or recognition from the global people? Another very interesting aspect of the word is that the way how the word settle, made, grow. Nobody can really make a good prediction. But of course, I'll talk about this later. But when I look at those words, I through my two books, particularly in my second book, Delicious Words, I look at many sort of culinary words that used in East Asia. And when you think about sort of those words, the words that survived and thrived over time, at least in the English language, the last 100 years, the words that to do with food. They don't remember many sort of very high cultural items. But food words people remember and they use, and those words survive and thrive throughout our linguistic communication. And so they are remaining in the dictionary, and people use it a lot. It's just very simple. Why? because we eat food. Without food, we can't survive. So food words are very popular, people without any knowledge or language, people, when we talk about, I was doing this in the library, public engagement, no word in Chinese or Japanese, but when we started talking about food, everybody has their own story, and they know a lot of the food words. So it was very sort of engaging conversation. But so social media and play so much role, and this sort of everyday word becoming almost had a status as a translingual word or English word, becoming almost global word. So I think social media plays a very important role in circulating and in making those words that could be considered as subcultural word as sort of more global words. And I took you through some of the sort of theoretical parts that I have in my book. So again, that's the same question, my answer. In order to answer this question, I started this project. Is it Japanese word sushi? Again, sashimi, the meaning or pronunciation, how people use different from the way how Japanese people use. Same with the Korean word, but then very often could say, well, this is wrong. You should do this way or the other. But again, like what I'm kind of trying to say in my book was, actually, nobody can say you're right and I'm wrong. I'm right, you're wrong, or you should do this way or the other way. Actually, nobody can do it. It's probably we must have, or people must have sent the word to the global lexicon, but the way how the words settle, the way how their meanings are added, nuances are made by the local users. So you can't just say this is wrong, you have to say this way or the other way. So it's what I'm trying to say is that the life trajectory of translingual words basically should be determined by the locals rather than the heritage speakers or by whoever linguistic authorities from the depart language. So this is what I just described. Translingual words live at the borders of language, constantly traveling, resettling in different languages, gaining subtle new meanings in the process. So this is very, very interesting. The words travel and their meanings are constantly changing. Again, if I think about the time before, maybe social media and globalization, the words, maybe, the set of words or the repertoire words more limited. And as I said, we are more exposed to local, media, local television, local newspapers. But I think social media really brought, and the globalization all brought things like, it's not like just, your topic is your issue, but it's everybody's, we have the same concern, like climate change, COVID-19 is something that we all have to tackle together, that together this made those global lexical or the translingual was much more important. When I think about COVID-19, for example, coronavirus, people don't really translate much, but they have the same words in a way, different pronunciation. And I think it makes sense because it also, people understand and, everybody can understand each other much better. So instead of trying to, bring up a new native word, people use the word as it is, and, also add more nuances or different localities to the meanings, but to the word. But mainly sharing the lexicon also is kind of the very important facilitator when it comes to communication. And the word meanings are dynamic. I'll talk about the word oppa later, the Korean word oppa, how it has become all, the meanings are added constantly, not like it's some kind of a closed meanings, but meanings are added constantly because the users change it and the context change all the time. So one word, but the meanings added, and it also influences the way how sort of Korean speakers use the word. So it's kind of not like one person's idea, but it's interactive and dynamic. So this is the kind of characteristic of translingual words. James Murray, 1911, he is the first editor of Oxford English Dictionary. He says basically that, he was kind of had this idea about English language, but in my book, which I'm going to come back next slide, but in this sort of the words, when you think about English words or those sort of words that used by the global citizens, there's a sort of kind of like subcultural words or hybrid words or foreign words are always kind of considered as marginal words. This is the same case in every language, wherever you are. whatever language you're speaking, kind of foreign words or subcultural words or hybrid words, they somehow considered as some sort of like, outside words. But as I said, like globalization and social media interaction with the different language speakers made this was also a kind of part of translingual words, part of global lexicon, part of the words that are used by the global people. And so, like when I'm thinking about word itself, it's just like our own identity, like layers of identity. You can't just say sushi is Japanese word, and also English word. But if it's used in German, it could be German words too. So it has layers of identity, just like my own identity would be like layered Korean, English, but then maybe another language, So it's kind of more and more. But in another sense, what we can also say that the borders of language may disappear too. So it's not like the description of Korean or description of English or description of Japanese itself maybe become more like meaningless or may change over time. I think, and like maybe just means that the heritage of Korean, the heritage of Japanese or English, rather than origin, it means that that's something that called purely Korean or purely Japanese. So I think this kind of shows the layers of identity for words, but layers of identity for ourselves. So I have this model of sunflower model, and I'll be super quick when it comes to more theoretical parts. But these different languages, when they interact, and basically what happens in the globalization, to more L1, L2 is languages, more languages interact, and as time grows, you can see like more language, more words from different languages become visible. So before maybe you didn't really English people wouldn't really know Korean words or Chinese word or Japanese word, but now because of sort of like more like globalized time, social media, more words become visible. So what we can see here is the core becomes much larger, which the core part means shared vocabulary. And even if you don't speak this language or the other language, we can somehow make communication happen because we have a large set of shared vocabulary created through translingualism or transculturalism by word traveling from everywhere. So we have a lot of shared vocabulary. English plays a very important role. So, someone who doesn't know any Japanese, someone who doesn't know any Chinese, can talk together because there are sort of many things they have common. And interestingly, they're not like Chinese origin word, but English words. Okay, like you meet somebody in Spain or in Russia, you don't know the languages of each other, but you can use a lot of sort of shared English vocabulary. So kind of what I'm trying to say, the shared vocabulary grows, but at the same time, diversity grows too. So commonality and diversity grows together in our time. So I call this translingual sunflower model that it's not like one becomes the other, but as you interact more languages become part of your linguistic repertoire. The core grows, diversity grows, commonality and diversity grow hand in hand. And we can see like many language stage one, few interaction, but more interaction actually means that more diversity, more colors become visible, and this is the way how translingual words are made and used and circulated. And monolingual lexical model cannot really explain this. Like the word like borrowing, loan, these words are very limited, as I said. So it's because interaction is very much diverse and active, interactive. So in order to somehow capture the dynamic and multilingual lexical item, we need a new model, and this is why I propose this translingual words and the sunflower model. And this is again like when I think about, I focus in the book more or less East Asian languages and English, but I guess this is kind of more the case in everywhere. This is the case in wherever you are. James Murray, the first editor of Oxford English Dictionary, he had this question when English started to be used by the global citizen, early 20th century. Like, how could we define English words? They somehow like picked up so many words, and they were wondering whether they should all be part of English language or not. If not, whether it's a good thing or not. Like, of course, in one way, if you adopt give the citizenship to all these words, it makes English language and lexicon big. It's good, one sense. But in another sense, one could say, oh, it means like, we want to have sort of more purist idea. So, we want to make our language pure. So there's two kind of the struggle, like whether we should include them or not. I think we can also repeat this kind of dialogue, or repeat this what is happening in James Murray's mind in our own identity. Should we give citizenship whoever comes from everywhere or not? Well, so there's sort of very much related the language and identity of ourselves and these words. But anyway, he had this idea like, how could we deal with these foreign words? And he used the word aliens and denizens of English language, aliens of English language. How do we do it? Shall we just say this is foreign words? But still, if the words to be used in English language, they have to be included. So what should we do? But then when you think about really the language, English language itself, let's just think about the food words alone, English food words. What is English food? Very difficult to say, what is the traditional English food, or what is the English food? What is it? It's very difficult to say. And as you can see, like fish and chips, well, is it really like has the Englishness, the Anglicity, or it's very difficult to define, because the English language itself has so many languages, contributed, so many contributions from all over the world, all languages too. But that was his question. And he said, English language is the languages of Englishmen. Of which Englishmen? Of all Englishmen? Of some Englishmen? Does it include English of Great Britain and English of America, Australia, South Africa, or some assertive Englishman, the Englishman of India who lives in bungalow, hunt in jungle, wear Ferrari hats and pajamas? So pajama is, when you think about pajama, oh, it's an English word, but actually it's a loan word in a way. It's from India. So you think about, the origin, actually it's from everywhere. And this was Murray's question. Yes, it's in its most comprehensive sense, and as an object of historical study, it includes all these. They are all forms of English. James Murray was very famous for having very inclusive view. Like it's very difficult to make distinction. Let's have everything in English. But the later editors had very different views. And although some of them really, said it is right to include all, but also there's some other stories, like, some said, oh, well, it's too much. Let's have some sort of sense, like, let's keep a quota. Let's not have everything in the dictionary. So there's we can think about a lot of political discussions that could have happened in the dictionary room, making room. And so this same discussion, what is the real English? What is really Japanese? What is really Korean? It's very difficult to define. And because nowadays it's, we ourselves difficult to define our native tongues or mother tongues. So it's, this is where we are. We can't even define our language in a singular tongue. And how could we define the words in a singular tongue? And that's becoming more the case as we live in this very multicultural, multilingual time. And, but also this word foreign, categorizing certain words as foreign is hard in this super diverse time. What does it mean to call a word foreign word? Or kind of when you think about our identity, someone calls someone foreigner, it doesn't really, have very much neutral meaning, but it has more nuanced meaning. If I call someone foreigner, it has more like, meaning, which is not very kind, say, kind of more excluding someone, it's a bit sort of inconsiderate. So it kind of foreign words has more nuanced meaning. But what I'm trying to say is, again, how could we actually define the foreignness in language, the identity of ourselves and the word itself? And the migration of words is not kind of new in a way in human history. It has always been the case. I think it's kind of more or less modern invention. Think about sort of more like standardized language, one language, like one global lingua franca. But I think we're going back to where we were before, like it's sort of how we lived with very much many language resources, linguistic repertoire all together to make meanings. So, when you think about this kind of example is so much everywhere. I'm just checking my time. I hope I have 10 minutes, or am I right? 10 minutes more? Okay, I'll be quick. So English, French, what is it? This is, people say, this is Japanese product, but language is very much like, we can't justify, well, is Japanese, English, French, or what is it, and we can see, translingual, you can't also say mini, so in what sense this is Japanese word? As I said before, like when you think about English culinary words, it's from everywhere. There's no like, broccoli, Italian, ketchup from Malay, noodle, German, tomato, everything what we eat. The food word that we think is English word is have foreign origin of some sort. And you see like, this, maybe we can skip this one. This sort of more Asian words, Japanese word were the majority after 1850, but nowadays sort of also changing, the picture is changing the way how the words enter into OED. So last week, the 26 Korean words entered Oxford English Dictionary. So it depends. There's so many factors that make the words become popular across the board. But again, like those words, and even if they enter the English language dictionary, but I think the way how it's used are more translingual, transcultural, global words rather than just English words. Because if we use it in Spain, or it's in Germany, they also have the German identity too. Like you can't say just English word. They would think this is all German word too. Yeah. Again, this is the Korean in Myeongdong. In Seoul, there's so many restaurants, but look, how could you say there's a bit of Korean, a bit of English, a bit of French, a bit of Japanese, bit of Chinese, everything all together. I thought this is a really good shows really well, where we live, our identity. When you think about what we eat daily, shows who we are. When you look at the food word, what we eat, kind of shows also the identity, how we become ourselves and our language all together become translingual and transcultural and transnational. And this is kind of my last slide. Oppa in Korean, I said I will talk about oppa. Oppa in Korean means like brother, like old elder brother, but also you can call someone in your same village, somebody older than you, oppa. So this is kind of the way how Korean, the seniority is the main meaning in oppa, male, but who is senior to you. And so you call somebody oppa. But somehow the K-pop, K-drama made, or K-film made oppa is kind of more, like your boyfriend. Southeast Asian people used oppa kind of more like your boyfriend, or like very much, they said it's hot guy or flirt, these sort of meanings because of the drama. So they added those meanings. And somehow in the Anglophone world, or the global fandom, understood the oppa, meaning of oppa as more to do with your kind of romance to your boyfriend, rather than, and have no meaning of seniority, which is really interesting for Koreans. The hierarchy, that is the main meaning in the meaning of oppa. But somehow the way how people used in Southeast Asia, which is kind of more like romantic sense, that became the main sense in oppa used in English language. And people nowadays think about oppa not as someone who is older than you, but kind of someone who you think very much close and romantic relationship. So it's, again, what I'm saying is the meaning changes, and Koreans say, oh, oppa actually means this, but now you can't say that anymore, because the users, this word oppa first originated from Korea, but it's settled in English language, and the users actually transform the meaning. So I would say the oppa actually has layers of different meanings. But also when you think about romanization, there's different oppa, different address term romanized different way and has different meanings. Again, because these users are not like necessarily Korean. So I think this shows how the word's meaning and identity could be diversified. One very interesting thing I found about oppa, again, this is oppa used in Vietnam context, oppa chicken, kind of meaning to bring some sort of, the meaning that they've gathered from Korean drama. So they wanted to convey the meaning. So this is oppa very much used in Southeast Asian context. But also I heard that Korean heritage speakers who are born in the UK, although their parents are Korean, they understand oppa in much more like English sense rather than the Korean sense. So they are Korean, their parents Korean, but they are living in Britain. they're born in England, so they are English, Korean English, but they chose to understand the meaning oppa not in a Korean way, but in the way how Korean fandoms understand. So again, what I can say is that it's kind of not like you have to use a word in a particular way prescribed by the language, but also you can choose one or the other. So it's very much like individually tailor-made, and the way how lexicon works in your mind is something that you pick up and you decide and you kind of stylize, the words, and so it's very much like very different from how we used to use the words, like in a very prescriptive manner, but in a way it's now become more individualized, tailor-made, and we use as we wish. So I will skip this slide I took, and this is maybe my final slide about mukbang. Again, Korean romanization would say M-E-O-K and mukbang, but all sound in Korean is difficult to romanize. So the fandoms hear the words all the time, mukbang, and they realize that all should become U sound, and they decided to romanize an M-U-K-B-A-G, although Korean government would say M-E-U-K. But in a way, in the Oxford English Dictionary, or the global users realize, well, what I hear is mukbang, not mukbang. So they registered mukbang, and they pronounce the word mukbang rather than mukbang, and use it in a global social media, and that became a word, that English word last week. So I entered the Oxford English Dictionary last September, and that kind of really shows again like the agency, that it's not like anymore we are recipient of words and we use the words, but very much ordinary people able to participate in developing the words, inventing new words, coining new words, using with their people. And that's kind of the mukbang case really shows it's not like linguistic authorities, but the very much pedestrian, ordinary people's job to make, use, and circulate new languages and new words. And so, yeah, I think this is the kind of characteristic of translingual words and transcultural words. And this is kind of the interview that I've done with Canadian Broadcasting last week, but I think this is, I think I've spoken too much maybe. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kier, for a very interesting talk. This is a lot of food for thought, talking about food items, very appropriate. And now our commentator, Marietta Regina, will give a few comments. Maria, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I can really relate to the love of food and love of various identity and languages interaction that we can observe nowadays. Let me see. So today, in this comment, I will briefly talk about 3 topics. So first of all, I will say a couple of words about your book, Translingual Words, an East Asian Lexical Encounter with English. And then I will give a very short reminder on English loan words in Japanese, and say a couple of words about use of English loan words in Japanese and identity representation. Throughout your book and your talk, the words are given the life of their own. And it inspires to think about languages, our society, and the ways we interact with each other from a very fresh perspective. In today's world, words are traveling from language to language, from East Asia and back to East Asia, from English-speaking countries and back to English-speaking countries. And we don't even need to travel along with them. Some of the new phenomena spread translingually without actual offline language contact. So the book covers 3 main topics as far as I understood. It talks about what translingual words are, Then it talks about the use of East Asian words in English and the use of English words in East Asian languages. I very enthusiastically recommend Translingual Words, an East Asian lexical encounter with English to all of the interested readers, both specialists and non-specialists. It reads as an academic monograph, but at the same time as a collection of exciting stories from life of the translingual words. And many of the examples in your book are taken from interaction between English and Japanese. And to no surprise, according to some of the estimates, 10% of the Japanese lexicon is loan words. And as many of you may know, Japanese lexicon consists of 3 types of vocabulary. Wago, words of Japanese origin, Kango, words of Chinese origin, and Gairaigo, words of foreign non-Chinese origin. And Gairaigo are usually words that originate from so-called Western languages. And recently, and especially in today's corona crisis, the main source of Gairaigo is the language of international communication, English. So what roles do English words or words coming from English play in Japanese and probably in other languages as well? As for example, with the current corona crisis, new words that came to Japanese, they serve to fill a gap, adding new concepts, new terminology to the language, for example, as lockdown or pandemic. At other times, words coming from English are used to create some kind of special effect, conveying some Western qualities, like words associated with Western lifestyle, or some of them are meant to express some trendy things. And some of them might be used to replace the native equivalents that have a negative connotation. And so that with this newcomer word, we can create more positive image of something like, for example, cleaning instead of soji in the context of cleaning work. Some words come to the language so that we are able to distinguish between something local and not local, as for example, with food. So we have examples as gohan and rice, or as you mentioned, chicken. And some of the words are simply meant to come into the language as euphemisms for some of the negatively connotated words. While being used in these various roles, the yesterday's newcomers start to live their own life in a language that they came to. And quite soon they start to be used with their own meanings or with some new connotations. And the first examples of such gradual separation that came to my mind were Japanese charenji and faito. Both of the words are coming from English, but today's Japanese charenji doesn't have a negative connotation of the original English challenge. You do not suffer through charenji. It is rather close to in meaning to try or to attempt to do something. And also Japanese faito, which I think was also mentioned in your book, is often used as do your best or go for it. And quite often, from my experience with these 2 examples as well, and many other words that came into the language like that and started their own life in Japanese, I hear that the native speakers who also know or learn English, they think that the use of the newcomer in Japanese language is incorrect because it is different from the use that they see in the language of origin. I will later ask you a question about that. And another thing that I want briefly to mention is identity of the speakers who use words that came to Japanese from English. Usually English loanwords are associated with some kind of prestige or open-mindedness or internationalism. And such words in marketing or advertising are considered to signify desire to identify as members of some cosmopolitan international society, and also can be used as keywords to present that the person belongs to a certain professional group, for example, IT industry. So in relation to the topics that I mentioned, I have these 3 questions to you. So, as you said, categorizing words as foreign is hard to sustain nowadays. But how do we overcome this common stereotype associated with foreignness of the words? What would you suggest is a good approach to educate people about translingual words? When and how, from what age, on what platform? The next question is, when is a word considered to be settled in a new language? Or can it be considered settled at any point in today's context, in today's translingual context? Or it's a never-ending circle? And could you give us some more examples of personal identity representation through translingual words? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So please go ahead, Yoon, with your answers.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very, very relevant question. So yeah, translingual words. I think this sort of, it's really important how we teach. I think we've been sort of so long time, kind of, how should I say, like heard that the way you use English language is wrong, as if like, and when you use wrong English, like Japanese or Konglish or like Singlish, always kind of have this sense that you're wrong. This is illegitimate word, or like, almost you feel like you kind of commit some crime, you're reading or making their languages. But I think that sort of that attitude should change, and I think it will change, because English, in order for English language to be used as a true global lingua franca for everyone, I think it's really that, it should embrace the diversity and has to, should have the room for the diversity. And in a way, I think it should be kind of more mutual effort from so-called in Katsura's circle, inner circle, different circle. I mean, he very much in 1985 made a circle like this, inner circle, outer circle, expanding circles. And I think nowadays it's, again, like the circle system also doesn't exist. Everybody uses English in some sense, and to a certain extent. But I think also, when it comes, I've written another book recently to do with children's language anxiety, but really like, many Asian people, including myself, have sort of like language anxiety when it comes to speaking English language. What if I make terrible grammar mistakes? I'm so bad. I think that should change really. And I think the kind of the discussion or about translingual words actually would make them to still feel about, it's not about right and wrong, it's about different. And when it comes about this, many English words that also many sort of foreign origin words in English language. Well, actually, there's 2 questions. Do you pronounce it in anglicized way, or do you pronounce it in the original way? When you think about, when we kind of insert more, what about original way? Then whatever English anglicized pronunciation will be all wrong. So what I'm saying is there's no wrong and right, and one should actually really respect the difference and diversity. And the words actually, many words that enter English language somehow to be used by more people. It means that more access, more people can be, able to use. And it's kind of not like because, English has such privilege, but it's pragmatic necessity that, you have the same lexicon, it facilitates communication. So in a way, I think what, it's a kind of future project and more like mutual project, and mutual kind of, it's also, but it affects everybody's life, that it's not about right and wrong. It's not about you have to do pronounce the English word in a particular way, or this way is right and this is wrong. But I think one should also understand the difference, and the way how English functions now. It's not like so more prescribed traditional way, but it's something like through English is made through interaction and through diverse. And just think about people who live in so-called English-speaking world. The population is so diverse, so it should really sort of consider those factors and make translingual words rather than English language, English words as sort of like more close-set. I think one has to be more open-minded and considerate, understanding, make also the discussion when it comes to education not about right and wrong, but that's a very different localized way, because the way how words work in local context will be all different. You can pronounce this word in your linguistic context this way, but maybe in sort of in British English you would do this way. So I think one has to work in more like kind of work on diversity side in the language, and have to promote really this translingualism in language education is what I really believe. And when is the word considered to be settled in a new language? I think this is a very, very interesting question. Well, I lived in England 20 years. I don't know whether I've settled well or not, but I do feel like I'm in the process of, settlement. I'm maybe I've settled better now than 20 years ago. What I'm trying to say is that it's a lifelong process. You can't say, well, I'm settled, well, I'm fully, it's again, like when you think about the settlement, it's a very much procedural, dynamic, and maybe lifelong procedure, same with the word, the way how the word settled, we can talk about entering, but the way how it settles, maybe we can't just say yes or no, this is settled or not. But I think again, like sort of it needs some kind of consideration and kindness to people who are coming from different places. But I think it's also same when it comes to the word, maybe different origins, but sort of the way how it's used in the local context can be more, can be more, more respected. And I think in a way, in this way, English language becomes more diverse, and those words will be able to settle very well. And I guess like the settlement is also to do with the treatment, and it's also very much related to dictionary or education, more authoritative level, but also at the same time, authority level, but also at the same time, I think it's kind of frequency. If people start use them a lot, they remain, as I say, they thrive and survive. And to do with many food words, nobody encourages those words to enter English language, but people eat those food all the time. Now they, people know what yaki udon is. No explanation is needed. So when actually culture interacts and they enter in everybody's life, I think they start to settle and become part of our lives too, and making up our sort of language together and culture together. So I think it's a very good question, but I think it's something lifelong procedure. And when it comes to like more everyday word, it's more easy to be part of our day-to-day words. And that's what I think. A final question, personal identity representation through translingual word. Do you mean like my snore? That sort of, as I said, probably, I don't know whether my example is right, but like the way how, what I discover about my own identity, the language, it's very much related. But I also, maybe I can give you another example. I was a pro-proctor in university last 2 years ago, and I was basically, the job was reading out the names and reading out names, and it was such challenge because so many names, and this question again came up, like how should I pronounce those names in their own way, but I don't know where they are from exactly. So is it a French name, Spanish name, or what is it? Like it's a kind of Chinese name, but which part of China is it? Then because pronunciation could be all different. What I'm given is only Romanized names. How can I get it right? And I really wanted to get it right because the parents and everybody there, I don't want to embarrass them. So I was studying, and I was thinking more about just translingual words. These words, like, I can't really trace them down their origin. I may be able to find out at nationality, but their life trajectory may be different. Well, they say, well, I'm actually from different place. So who I can tell? Every single name has different stories. every single word has different story. It's exactly the same. And what we can just say is that we have to embrace the diversity. You know, there's no one way, but there should be more different ways, and we should actually be more open to this diverse life trajectory of those words, just as we have to be more open to more diverse trajectories of individuals' lives. That's what I can say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. There's so many things to talk about loanwords and identity, but unfortunately it is a time to close this session. As I said, we'll have more seminars come up, and we have a live session on November 25th. So I hope you'll all be able to participate in this session as well. So thank you very much once again, Jiwoon and Maria, and thank you very much for your attention. See you at the next session.